A businessman from Lagos steps into a crowded market in northern Nigeria. He's far from home. Different culture, different skyline, different food. He asks a question, and a fisherman from the Niger Delta answers him without missing a beat. A truck driver from Kano leans in and adds his own thoughts. Within minutes, a university student, a street vendor, and a police officer are all laughing together about something that just happened. None of them share a mother tongue. Every single one of them understood exactly what was said. They weren't speaking English. Not exactly. They were speaking something older than the word for it. Something that grew in the cracks between empires, in the noise of harbor towns, in the patience of two strangers trying desperately to understand each other. A language that hundreds of millions of people use every day, and that almost nobody can fully explain. To understand where it came from, you have to leave Nigeria entirely. You have to go back to the water. Stretching from the Atlantic shoreline inward through forest and savanna and river basin lies one of the most linguistically extraordinary places on Earth. Nigeria alone contains more than 500 documented languages. Not dialects, languages. Communities separated by an afternoon's walk sometimes spoke in ways completely unintelligible to their neighbors. Travel just a few hours in any direction, and the sounds around you could change entirely. This was not chaos. It was centuries of human settlement. Different peoples, different histories, different ways of making sense of the world they'd inherited. West Africa was, and remains, a place where cultural specificity runs so deep that the very ground seems to speak in multiple registers. But there was a practical problem buried inside all that richness. How do thousands of communities trade without speaking the same language? The answer didn't come from inside Nigeria. It came from the sea. In the early 1400s, Portuguese explorers began pushing their ships farther down Africa's western coastline than any Europeans had ventured before. They weren't looking for Nigeria specifically. They were looking for routes around the continent toward the spice markets of Asia. But along the way, they found something else. Coastal kingdoms, trade networks, gold, ivory, palm oil, and eventually, to their lasting historical shame, human beings. Each new encounter produced the same immediate obstacle. The Portuguese couldn't speak the local languages. The merchants waiting on shore couldn't speak Portuguese. Commerce required communication. Without words, without some shared point of reference, ships sat idle and goods stayed where they were. What happened next wasn't planned by anyone. It wasn't the result of a royal decree or a diplomatic agreement. It emerged the way most useful things emerge, from necessity repeated thousands of times until it became habit. Both sides began simplifying. Strip away complicated grammar. Focus on essential vocabulary. Point at things. Repeat. Borrow a word when you need it. Invent a shorthand when nothing else works. The goal was never elegance. The goal was understanding. And it was remarkable how much understanding two people could reach when they really needed to. Linguists call the result a pidgin. That word gets misused constantly. Pidgin is not broken speech. It's not the slurred product of confusion or ignorance. It is a contact language, a practical system that emerges naturally when groups without a shared tongue need to communicate regularly enough that improvisation alone stops working. Pidgins have grammar. They have consistent patterns. They have rules, just not the rules of any single parent language. But here's what makes the Nigerian case so interesting. The earliest traders spoke Portuguese. So why is Nigerian Pidgin built largely on English? That answer wouldn't arrive for another 400 years. History rarely announces its turning points. It tends to drift. Empires expand and then quietly contract. Trade languages follow power, and power moves. By the 18th and 19th centuries, British commercial influence along the West African coast had grown to dominate what Portuguese traders had once controlled. The language of commerce shifted with it. English vocabulary began overtaking Portuguese. New words entered the emerging contact language. Old structures persisted from what came before. What was left behind wasn't English. It certainly wasn't Portuguese. It was something that had absorbed both and then grown away from each of them in its own direction. A living system shaped by living people in living circumstances, which means it kept changing long after anyone expected it to settle down. Researchers are still working out exactly how that transformation unfolded. Some of the evidence lies buried inside the words themselves. Listen closely to Nigerian Pidgin today and you'll hear vocabulary that traces back to English unmistakably. Words for everyday things, for movement and food and family and the texture of daily life. But underneath those familiar sounds, you'll also catch remnants of older contact languages, echoes of African linguistic structures, borrowed pronunciations that took odd turns somewhere across the centuries. Linguists still debate the precise ancestry of individual words. The picture is genuinely complicated, and that complexity is part of what makes the language worth studying. Every familiar expression carries layers of history, like archaeological artifacts buried inside ordinary speech. And the deeper researchers dug into those layers, the more surprising the story became. Picture the ports along the Bight of Benin a few centuries ago. Canoes glide through shallow water. European ships sit at anchor beyond the surf line. Crates of cloth are unloaded. Palm oil, metal tools, salt, and textiles move in the opposite direction. The air is thick with heat and voices. No single language dominating. Conversations assembled from whatever fragments each side could offer the other. Portuguese word here. An English phrase there. A local expression that doesn't translate but somehow communicates the right thing. A borrowed pronunciation. A gesture that bridges the gap. This wasn't disorder. It was adaptation in real time. And over generations, enough generations that the children of those original traders grew up hearing it, then used it with their own children. Adaptation became tradition. The makeshift became the standard. The temporary became permanent. As trade expanded, so did the language that had grown up inside it. It moved from ports into surrounding neighborhoods, from traders to laborers, from interpreters and middlemen to the families who lived near them. For a long time, it remained what linguists call a second language, something people used with strangers, while keeping their native tongue for everything that really mattered. Home, family, prayer, memory. Most pidgins stay there. Functional and temporary, picked up when needed and set down when not. The majority of the world's contact languages never grew beyond that. But occasionally, rarely, something else happens. Children begin acquiring the pidgin as their first language. They don't learn it from textbooks or teachers. They absorb it the way all children absorb language. From the world around them, from caregivers and neighbors and friends and the ambient noise of wherever they happen to be born. When that happens, everything changes. A language learned by children develops in ways a second language simply cannot. Grammar becomes more complex. Expressive range widens. What was once a practical bridge becomes, generation by generation, a home. Linguists have a name for that transition. When a pidgin is learned natively, it becomes a Creole, a fully developed language with its own grammatical system, its own emotional register, its own way of holding human experience. The distinction matters enormously, and it became one of the most debated questions surrounding Nigerian Pidgin, because different communities made that transition at different times and in different ways. The implications for how scholars categorize the language, and for what rights and recognition it might deserve, would take decades to fully work through. Fast forward to modern Nigeria, and the scale of what has happened becomes hard to overstate. Estimates suggest tens of millions of people speak Nigerian Pidgin with genuine fluency, and many millions more understand it well enough to follow any conversation conducted in it. That would make it one of the most widely used contact languages on the African continent, and one of the most significant languages in the world by speakers, if you count it fairly. Yet, for most of its history, it was dismissed. Broken English, bastardized speech, something to grow out of. The condescension had a long life, and understanding why requires sitting with a deceptively simple question. What actually makes a language real? If Nigerian Pidgin were just English spoken incorrectly, fluent English speakers should have no trouble understanding it. They often do. The surface resemblance to English is real. Many words have recognizable English roots: water, house, market, school. But language is not a vocabulary list. It's a system. And the system of Nigerian Pidgin is not the system of English. Modern linguistic research has shown that Nigerian Pidgin operates according to consistent grammatical rules, not random simplifications, but predictable, learnable patterns that speakers follow with precision, even when they've never formally studied the language. Consider how tense and aspect work. In English, time is embedded in the verb itself. I walk versus I walked versus I am walking. In Nigerian Pidgin, those distinctions are carried by particles, small words that slot in around the verb to signal what's happening, what's finished, what's ongoing. I to go market. The particle signals an action currently in progress. The speaker is, right now, on the way to the market. It isn't a guess. It isn't an approximation of English. It is a grammatical structure doing exactly what grammatical structures are supposed to do, communicating precise meaning efficiently. She don chop. Here, don marks a completed action. She has eaten. Past tense, but expressed through a system entirely different from English's verb inflections. Every speaker of the language knows this without having to think about it. That's what grammar actually looks like. Not rules memorized from textbooks, rules absorbed so deeply they feel like intuition. Nigerian Pidgin speakers aren't making errors. They're following a different set of instructions. Once researchers recognized that the old question, is this a real language, stopped being interesting. Of course it was. The more useful question was what it could teach about how languages work. For much of the colonial period, English occupied the formal spaces of Nigerian life. Schools, courts, government documents. The language of empire sat at the top of an invisible hierarchy, and climbing that hierarchy meant mastering it. Fluency in Standard English became associated with education, with social mobility, with the kind of respectability institutions rewarded. Meanwhile, Nigerian Pidgin lived in the places where actual daily life unfolded. Markets and ports, construction sites and barracks, street corners and family gatherings, and the particular warmth of conversations between people who didn't share an ethnic background but had figured out how to find each other anyway. It connected people long before any official institution acknowledged that connection had value. The contradiction was striking. The language most useful for navigating everyday reality was precisely the one receiving the least recognition from the institutions that shaped how people thought about language. History would eventually complicate that hierarchy, but not before it extracted a significant cost. As Nigeria urbanized through the 20th century, something unprecedented happened. Millions of people from hundreds of distinct linguistic backgrounds became neighbors. Lagos, Port Harcourt, Warri, Benin City, Abuja, these cities were not melting pots in any simple sense. They were places of enormous cultural complexity, where Yoruba and Igbo and Hausa and Ijaw and dozens of other traditions existed in close proximity, maintaining their own identities while also negotiating a shared civic life. English served some of those negotiations, but Nigerian Pidgin served more of them. It was faster to reach, warmer in register, less loaded with the associations of colonial authority that clung to Standard English no matter how useful Standard English was. And crucially, it didn't belong to any one ethnic group. No single community could claim it as their own. That made it available to everyone, which made it something rare. A language that people could share without any of them having to give something up. That quality, the sense of belonging without exclusion, may be the single most important reason Nigerian Pidgin didn't fade when it might have. It became common ground in a country that needed common ground badly. Stand on a busy corner in Lagos and listen carefully. Then travel to Warri. Then to Port Harcourt. Then to Benin City. The language you hear across all of them is recognizably the same, and yet it isn't quite identical. Pronunciation shifts. Local vocabulary surfaces. Expressions that land perfectly in one city don't quite translate in another. Linguists call these regional varieties, and their existence is not a sign of fragmentation. It's a sign of life. Every major language does this. English sounds different in Lagos than it does in London, than it does in Kingston, than it does in Kolkata, and those differences don't make any of them less English. They make English a living thing, responsive to the people who carry it through time. Nigerian Pidgin works the same way. The fact that it adapts to communities rather than demanding they adapt to it is part of what makes it so durable. Turn on a Nigerian radio station today. You might hear the morning news delivered entirely in Nigerian Pidgin. Not as comedy or novelty, not as a feature for people who don't speak English well enough. As journalism, delivered to an audience that finds it natural and immediate in ways that standard English sometimes isn't. Broadcasters figured this out through simple observation. Millions of listeners understood Nigerian Pidgin immediately and thoroughly, in the way you understand something that lives close to the center of your life rather than in the formal margins of it. The audience was already there. The medium just had to catch up. In 2017, the BBC launched BBC News Pidgin, providing news content in West African pidgin varieties for audiences across the region. The decision surprised many observers outside Africa. Inside Nigeria, it felt less like an announcement than a recognition, an acknowledgement of something that had been true for a long time, finally making it into official language. Then came the music. Afrobeats, the sound that emerged from Nigeria and went everywhere, carries Nigerian Pidgin inside it the way a river carries sediment. Constantly, naturally, without making a project of it. Listen to the biggest Nigerian artists of the past 2 decades and you'll hear them move between standard English, Yoruba, Igbo, and Nigerian Pidgin sometimes within a single verse. The switching isn't code confusion. It's texture. Each language brings a different emotional color. Nigerian Pidgin carries something specific, an ease, a groundedness, a humor that lands differently than it would in any other register. When those songs reached London and Toronto and Johannesburg and Kingston and New York, they carried their language with them. Listeners who had never been to Nigeria started singing phrases whose origins stretched back 5 centuries. Language had become culture. Culture had become global. And in living rooms and nightclubs and earbuds on subway trains, something born in the ports of the Bight of Benin was quietly becoming part of the world's soundtrack. The internet changed how languages move. For centuries, a language spread through migration and trade and the slow accumulation of human contact. Now a single video can introduce millions of people to an expression they've never heard before, and by the following morning, that expression is being imitated by people on 3 different continents. Nigerian comedians, content creators, musicians, and influencers began using Nigerian Pidgin online as a matter of course, and something remarkable followed. A language that had existed primarily in speech began developing a written register. Memes appeared, comment sections filled with expressions that a generation earlier might never have been written down at all. Digital slang evolved with a speed that traditional linguistic change simply cannot match. This raised a real question, and it deserves to be taken seriously. Can a language remain coherent while changing this fast? Does the pressure of digital virality distort something that took centuries to build? History offers a complicated answer. Every language we consider established today was once accused of corrupting something older. English was called a barbarization of Latin. French was considered a degradation of the classical. Yoruba and Hausa and Igbo have all changed across the centuries in ways that would be unrecognizable to speakers from 500 years ago. Change is not the danger. The question is always whether the people using a language are still finding it, still reaching each other through it. As long as they are, the language is doing its job. Nigerian Pidgin is still doing its job. Remarkably well. For decades, one of the most persistent arguments against taking Nigerian Pidgin seriously as a language was educational. The worry went like this: children who grew up using Pidgin instead of standard English would be disadvantaged. They would struggle with formal literacy. They would be less prepared for the institutions that required English fluency to navigate. The argument wasn't made in bad faith. Multilingual education is genuinely complicated, and the stakes for children are real. But modern linguistic research has steadily complicated the premise. Studies on bilingualism consistently show that acquiring multiple language systems simultaneously does not confuse children, and in many contexts, it strengthens the cognitive flexibility they'll need for everything else. The outcomes depend on educational access, social context, exposure, and support, not on whether a child's home language is a prestigious one. The debate shifted. It stopped being about whether Nigerian Pidgin was real. That argument had been settled. It became about something more practical and more urgent. How do multilingual societies value all the languages they actually use, rather than only the ones that arrived with the institutions that evaluated them? That is not a question Nigeria has finished answering. but asking it seriously is itself a kind of progress. Today, Nigerian Pidgin occupies a space that would have been unimaginable a generation ago. Linguists study its grammatical architecture. Historians trace its evolution through trade records and colonial documents and the faint linguistic fossils buried in contemporary speech. Sociologists examine what it reveals about belonging, who uses it with whom, and what that choice signals about identity and solidarity and distance. Writers are using it in literature and digital storytelling. Media organizations publish in it. Academic papers are devoted to it. The language that was once described as an embarrassment in schools and courthouses is now the subject of serious scholarly attention across multiple disciplines. Its growing visibility reflects something real, a shift in what we consider worth studying. Not what powerful institutions declared important. What millions of people actually chose to speak. There is an experiment you run on yourself every day without noticing it. You walk into a room full of strangers and within seconds, sometimes within a single exchange, you start adjusting. Your pace changes. Your vocabulary shifts. You might soften an accent or lean into it. You might switch languages entirely, or drop a register, or deploy a phrase you'd never use in a different context. You do this without conscious deliberation. The adjustment is instantaneous and social and deeply human. That unconscious flexibility may be the real explanation for Nigerian Pidgin's survival. Not just what the language is, but what it does to the people who use it. At the beginning of this story, Nigerian Pidgin looked like a linguistic accident. A practical solution that emerged from trade along the West African coast, useful enough to persist but too informal to take seriously. But useful ideas don't last for centuries through accident alone. They last because they keep solving a problem. The problem Nigerian Pidgin kept solving was belonging. Not the belonging that comes from sharing an ethnic background or a family name or a mother tongue. Those are real, but they exclude as much as they include. The belonging it offered was something different. The recognition that passes between strangers who discover they have a language in common that neither of them was born into. The small but genuine surprise of finding common ground where you expected foreignness. It didn't ask anyone to abandon their identity. It gave people a way to move between identities without losing either. That distinction is everything. It explains why Nigerian Pidgin endured while hundreds of other contact languages from the same period simply dissolved back into the languages that produced them. For millions of Nigerians, language is not a single thing. A person might speak Yoruba at home with parents and grandparents, switch to Nigerian Pidgin with friends from different ethnic backgrounds, study in Standard English, conduct business in English, and then slip back into Yoruba or Pidgin on the way home depending on who's in the car. The switching is constant. Most of the time it's invisible, so automatic that people don't experience it as effort. Linguists call this code switching, and they've spent decades arguing about what it means. Some early researchers saw it as evidence of linguistic insecurity, as though people who moved between languages couldn't fully commit to any one of them. That interpretation has been largely abandoned. The evidence now points in the opposite direction. Fluent code switching reflects high linguistic competence. Every transition carries meaning. Moving into Nigerian Pidgin can signal warmth, humor, solidarity, or the comfortable informality of people who trust each other. Moving into Standard English can signal professionalism, or deliberate distance, or the formality a particular context demands. The switching itself is a form of communication, layered on top of the words. Language, in this sense, becomes social intelligence. Something you use to navigate relationships as much as to exchange information. Listen long enough in a busy Nigerian city and you'll hear something extraordinary. Conversations that begin in English, shift into Nigerian Pidgin, borrow an expression from Yoruba, touch briefly on Hausa, then return to Pidgin before ending in English. The whole thing lasts 3 minutes and contains 4 languages. To someone on the outside, it might sound chaotic. To the people inside it, the transitions are as natural as breathing. Each language contributes something the others can't quite replicate. Each carries its own emotional texture, its own relationship to the moment being discussed. The conversation flows according to relationships. That's more important than any rule. The story doesn't stop at Nigeria's borders. Across West Africa, English-based Pidgin and Creole varieties have developed through related historical processes, each shaped by its own local history and cultural context. Cameroon Pidgin, Ghanaian Pidgin, Creole in Sierra Leone, which has creolized so thoroughly that linguists treat it as a fully native language for many of its speakers. These varieties share a common ancestry and recognizable family resemblances, but they followed their own evolutionary paths. Just as the English spoken in Lagos differs from the English spoken in London, and the Spanish of Mexico City is not the Spanish of Madrid. There isn't one Pidgin. There are many living traditions, connected by history, shaped by communities, and still evolving in ways that no researcher has fully mapped. Think back to those Portuguese ships approaching the West African coast more than 500 years ago. The merchants standing on the shoreline watching them come. Neither side had any idea what the encounter would eventually produce. They were thinking about trade, about cloth and gold and safe passage. They were not thinking about grammar. They were not imagining that the improvised communication systems they were about to create would outlast their own empires. The Portuguese Empire declined. British colonial rule eventually ended. Trade routes changed. Governments fell and rose and fell again. Technology transformed every aspect of how human beings communicate. And through all of it, through every rupture and reinvention, the language born from those first halting exchanges between strangers kept adapting. Not because anyone decided to preserve it, because millions of ordinary people, generation after generation, kept finding it useful. History preserves solutions. Everything else eventually disappears. What began as a tool for getting through the next transaction became the language of neighborhoods. Then of music and comedy and journalism and film. Then of social media and global celebrity and the particular intimacy of a joke that lands perfectly across cultural distance. Each generation added something without erasing what came before. And through all that accumulation, 5 centuries of it, the language remained recognizably itself. That may be its most remarkable quality. Not that it survived. Languages survive through inertia all the time. What's remarkable is that Nigerian Pidgin never stopped growing, never stopped absorbing new influences, never calcified into something that only remembered where it came from. It kept changing because the people who used it kept changing, and it changed with them, accommodating the new without losing the old. Very few languages manage that. Fewer still manage it for 500 years. So what is Nigerian Pidgin? Not English. This grammar says so clearly. Not a mistake. Its consistency says so. Not simple. The ease of code switching says so. Not temporary. 5 centuries of continued use says so. It is a language that communities built together out of the materials history gave them: colonial encounter, forced displacement, migration, urbanization, digital connection, and shaped into something that serves the actual texture of people's lives better than any of the languages it borrowed from. Its greatest achievement has nothing to do with prestige or official recognition. It's that it gave millions of people a way to find each other across the enormous diversity of a country where difference is not the exception but the fundamental condition of existence. When history creates barriers between people, human beings find ways around them. Sometimes those workarounds become permanent. Sometimes they become something more: a culture, a tradition, an identity. A way of saying we are more connected than the circumstances of our birth suggest. Somewhere in Nigeria tonight, conversations are unfolding in Nigerian Pidgin. Millions of them. Arguments and jokes, love declarations and business negotiations, stories about what happened yesterday and plans for what comes next. Most of the people in those conversations aren't thinking about the Portuguese ships, or the colonial trade ports, or the generations of linguists who spent careers arguing about whether their language was real. They're just talking, laughing, trying to explain something to someone who needs to understand it. The most extraordinary histories are often hidden inside the most ordinary moments. You just have to know how to listen.